The Philadelphia Eagles have gotten a lot better at hitting on their first-round draft picks over the last few years, but they really do still make their money on day 2 and day 3. Sleepers to target coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. I'm your host, Louie DiBiase. Thanks so much for tuning in to this Friday edition of LOE. It is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. So, Howie Roseman, when he first came back as the Eagles GM in 2016, of course, that first round was monumental, trading up for Carson Wentz. That really started this entire era of Eagles football that has followed up with 3 Super Bowl appearances, 2 rings. But when you look at the majority of his first rounds in that first stint of his return, it wasn't great after Carson Wentz. Derek Barnett was not a great draft pick for a top 20 selection. 2018, he moved down, did not have a pick. 2019, Andre Dillard, that was a bust. 2020, Jalen Reagor, that was a bust. Even if you go back to his first time as general manager, taking somebody like Marcus Smith in the first round of 2014, that was a bust. Howie Roseman has been very up and down when it comes to his first rounds. I will say later on in his career, the last few years, Quinyon Mitchell, Nolan Smith, Jalen Carter, Devontae Smith, he's been nailing them as of late. Even Jordan Davis, if that's the worst pick he's made since 2021, since the post-Carson Wentz era, you're not doing a really bad job. You're doing okay. So Howie Roseman has gotten a lot better over the years at hitting on those day 1 picks. But I will still say his bread and butter building this roster still comes from day 2 selections, day 3 picks, even finding undrafted gems like a Reed Blankenship. That really is Howie Roseman and the scouting department's bread and butter. And actually, when you look at it, their second round is historically great. When you combine Howie's 2 stints as general manager, I mean, you could throw in there Zach Ertz back in 2013, and even before that, Vinny Curry in 2012, and Michael Kendricks that year as well. You look at 2014, Jordan Matthews was an okay player. 2017, Sidney Jones, that one didn't hit as much, but 2018, Dallas Goedert. 2019, Miles Sanders was a good pick. 2020, Jalen Hurts, the greatest quarterback in Eagles history. And then, you keep going. Landon Dickerson, Cooper DeJean, Cam Jurgens. The list goes on and on. Howie Roseman on day 2 has been incredible. Round 3 lately, he's gotten Nakobe Dean and Jalix Hunt. Of course, day 3, we've seen some absolute beauties. Jordan Mailata, Josh Sweat. Even this past year, getting some solid role players like Will Shipley and Jeremiah Trotter Jr. Of course, a few years ago, Reed Blankenship's an undrafted rookie. Corey Clement, an undrafted rookie running back, leads the team in receiving in their first ever Super Bowl win. This is what Howie Roseman does. And I do think there are some sleepers this year that he could target on day 2 or day 3. That's that next batch of players we're saying, how did the NFL let Howie Roseman steal that guy? He continues to thrive in that market of talent acquisition. Here are 4 players I think Howie Roseman would take a chance on day 2 or day 3 that can be seen as those next steals for the Philadelphia Eagles. On day 2, I have an offensive and defensive player. Day 3 as well. On offense, I like Syracuse tight end Oronde Gadsden. He's a guy that kind of gets, I think hidden in the weeds a little bit because it's such a deep tight end class with, of course, the top 2, Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland. You got Mason Taylor, Harold Fannin, Elijah Arroyo. There's a lot of interesting players in this class, but Oronde Gadsden, if you want this kind of wide receiver, tight end hybrid that's going to be like a big Y, he's going to be a stand-up. He's not going to put his hands in the dirt and block a lot. But if you want that overhang kind of tight end receiver hybrid playing inside, that's 6'5", that has an enormous wingspan, that can make really tough grabs, that's a good separator. He's a mismatch against linebackers, potentially safeties. Gadsden is a player that, if you miss out on that top 6, again, that's Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1 is Warren and Loveland. Then you get into tier 2, like fringe first-round picks, more like second-round selections. Mason Taylor, I'll say Gunnar Helm as well, who I did mention, Elijah Arroyo, and Harold Fannin. Those are the other 4 in tier 2 after those top 2 in tier 1. After those 6, like let's say the Eagles go with a guard or a tackle in the first round, and then they take a pass rusher with their second-round pick, and they miss out on that tight end run. I think if they want to get into tier 3, Gadsden might be that best option, especially if you lose Dallas Goedert and you're looking for more of a pass catcher. I think he's somebody to target. He'll probably be, I would say, a late third-round pick, maybe an early fourth rounder. This is a player that I think is worth betting on his traits on day 2. Of course, he is smaller for a tight end from a frame perspective. He's 6'5", has an elite wingspan for the position, but he's a skinnier player. Like, this is more of a wide receiver tight end hybrid. I don't think you're going to ask him to put his hands in the dirt, line up next to Lane Johnson or Jordan Mailata, and block. But if he puts on some more strength, puts on some more LBs without sacrificing that athleticism, you've got a player. Like, this could be a red zone threat that if you want that size to compete with Johnny Wilson, for that big receiver role, if you need a guy to replace Dallas Goedert and you don't take a tight end early, or let's say you do make it work with Dallas Goedert, but you're looking for an heir apparent, I think Gadsden's a really interesting player that I'm not hearing a lot of people talk about. I think he has really natural hands. He's a hands catcher, not a basket catcher. He goes up and high points the football, really good body control. I think he's a good red zone weapon if you're looking to add that kind of player. So that's a sleeper on day 2 in a deep tight end class that might fall with some good value at the end of round 3. Maybe he does fall early to day 3, round 4. I would say, though, he's projected more as a third-round pick because after we talk about those top 6 tight ends who are all first and second round selections, in my opinion, Gadsden's like the best of the next bunch. So I do say if the Eagles want him, he'll probably have to be their third round pick. But I really like his tape after I was doing some tight end evaluation over this past weekend. He was a guy that I definitely want to talk about. Another day 2 player that I think is being slept on, again, in a deep class. He's kind of a needle in a haystack right now because there's just so many options to discuss, is Michigan edge rusher Josiah Stewart. I think he might be, from a production standpoint, maybe the best second-round pass rushing option the Eagles can add. And I like a lot of those players, like Princely Uman-Milan, Ivy from Ole Miss, and Uman-Milan from Ole Miss, as I just mentioned. Super interesting players. You look at like Jordan Birch from Oregon, another traits guy that's extremely interesting. But Josiah Stewart, not only does he have the speed you want on the edge, he has the flexibility, the bend, the athleticism, the ability to drop back in coverage. I think he's a player that Vic Fangio would really like stylistically. He's similar to Jalix Hunt in a way. When I watched him on tape, he gave me some Jalix Hunt vibes. Like, he wins with speed to power. So it's not like this is a floor player that's not very talented and it's all about production. Like, he is explosive. He is a speed rusher on the edge. His strength is getting after the quarterback. One thing that he lacks, though, is, I would say, ideal size and length for this position, but man, is he productive. Like, he is one of the most productive edge rushers in this class, and if he was a little bit bigger and had a bigger wingspan, I think we'd be talking about a first-round pick. He actually had, of all these top guys that we're discussing in this class, he had the top pass rush win rate among all of them in 2024. So Josiah Stewart, if we're talking about that 64th overall pick, he might not even be available by that point. You might have to trade up a little bit, or let's say you trade down from 32 and you have an earlier second-round pick. That might even be the Eagles' first selection this year. I think he's somebody that would be really intriguing. And again, there's so many other options in this class. Like, a team might prefer one of the Ohio State guys, Jack Sawyer or Tumi Mullo. There's 3 different players to choose from Ole Miss. Jordan Birch from Oregon, as I mentioned, has really interesting traits. Nick Scorton as well from Texas A&M. It might push Stewart down the board in last year's class. I think you can make the argument, even with his size, like his lack of length, ideal length, and power, like against the run. I think that's somewhere he could grow is against the run. He would still maybe be a first-round pick last year. Like, I think with along the lines of a Dallas Turner, that's the kind of tier that he might have fit in last year. I think Stewart's a really interesting player on day 2. That second round option, if the Eagles don't take a pass rusher with that first pick and want to come back around on day 2 early, I think Josiah Stewart is somebody to keep an eye out for. So those are 2 guys on day 2. Syracuse tight end Oronde Gadsden and Michigan edge rusher Josiah Stewart. When we're talking about day 3 options on offense, Miles Frazier from LSU, I love his versatility. I think Jeff Stoutland could take his raw talent and mold him into that swing lineman that could play guard, that could play tackle. This guy's 6'5", over 300 pounds. Again, a little raw. I think he's not as athletic getting upfield as some of these other linemen, but if you want a power blocker in the run game like you had with Mekhi Becton, Miles Frazier's an interesting player to keep an eye on. And again, day 3, I like taking offensive linemen. Give Jeff Stoutland that ball of clay and let him mold him into the next great success story of Stoutland University. And then a day 3 sleeper on defense to take an eye out for is Notre Dame defensive tackle Riley Mills. This is a pass rush specialist that if you're trying to make up for Milton Williams' production heading to New England, I think Riley Mills could be a good complement to Jalen Carter, Moro Ijoma, and Jordan Davis. 7.5 sacks last year on the interior, actually led Notre Dame in sacks on defense, and they made it all the way to the national championship. He's actually a former edge rusher that kicked inside. He's got some pass rush juice, and he's 6'5". Again, not ideal length, but he's very powerful, and he's a complete edge rusher or defensive tackle. I think he could play edge as well. He's got a complete bag. Like, he has good counters. I like his swim move. His bull rush is really impressive. He's not bad against the run, but this is, again, more of a third down rushing specialist to add to this rotation to compete with Thomas Booker for depth. But when we're talking about a day 3 player that has a good chance of consistently getting to the quarterback, a solid role player, I like Riley Mills from Notre Dame. So those are 2 day 3 guys to keep an eye out for. Miles Frazier from LSU, a versatile tackle guard prospect from LSU, and then Notre Dame defensive tackle Riley Mills against 7.5 sacks last year on the interior for Notre Dame. Howie Roseman, what he does best still to this day, even though he's been better at nailing these first round picks, day 2, day 3, that's where he makes his money, and I think he'll do it again in the 2025 NFL draft. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, I've been doing a lot of overall league-wide mock drafts, not just making the Eagles selection, but I'm trying to get predictive, see how the board's going to fall, what other teams are going to do in the first round, what other NFC contenders are going to do. I have 5 draft picks we should not be rooting for, picks that we don't want to see happen for other NFC contenders. I'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. This episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the nets. I've got my eye on a few underdogs. FanDuel makes it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. The FanDuel app is simple to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly, no waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com, get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Getting ready for the 2025 NFL Draft less than a month away now. I cannot believe it. Getting ready for the Eagles' 32nd overall selection that I highly doubt they make the pick there. Odds are they're going to trade up or trade down. That's what Trader Howie does. I can't imagine he sits on his hands and makes that pick with the final selection of the first round. And there's a lot of scenarios that I'm kind of hoping play out. Like, I'm not feeling super picky this year. I think there's a lot of selections that I'd be cool with. You want to take a guard this year in the first round? All right, dope. You want to take a safety? I'm in. That's the biggest hole on this Eagles roster right now in the starting lineup. You want to take a pass rusher? Yes, please. It's a loaded class. Heck, you could talk me into right now wide receiver, linebacker, cornerback. I'm kind of open-minded this year. So what exactly I'm rooting for the Eagles, I would like to add a safety early in this draft. I would like to add a premier pass rusher from a deep class with one of your first 2 picks. That's on my wish list. Give me a safety. Give me a defensive lineman. I would like another guard to compete with Tyler Steen and Kenyon Green that can also play tackle maybe in the future. But overall, again, I'm not really rooting for anything super hard for the Eagles. Whatever the outcome is, I'll probably be okay with. Again, Howie gave me my draft last year. He gave me 2 corners, back-to-back picks, Rookie of the Year finalists, Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, but who, by the way, is working out with Pat Surtain this week, which is great to hear. I'm feeling pretty solid about this draft no matter what. I will say I am rooting against certain picks from happening when it comes to other NFC contenders improving and trying to get closer to the Eagles in this conference. I think when you look at there's 5 teams I'm watching. The San Francisco 49ers, I still think they're not completely done from competing in this conference. And then the other top 2 teams competing with the Eagles this year, I think, are the Commanders and the Rams. So the 49ers, the Lions, and the Commanders. And then, for me, I think the Dallas Cowboys are a team to look out for. Not to look like that we're scared of, that could, take the Eagles down in the NFC East, but they have a top 15 pick, and there is a player that if they take, could give the Eagles some trouble in this division. So I'm really looking at those teams, some division rivals and some other top contenders in this conference, picks that I don't want to see happen in the first round from those teams. So let's get into it. The first pick I don't want to see is from the Los Angeles Rams, taking Ohio State wide receiver Emeka Egbuka. I do not want to see that. Egbuka is the most Rams wide receiver I've ever seen. An inline receiver that's going to play in the slot the majority of the time, a good blocker, a technician as a route runner. Those choice routes, he can really kill you. Really good hands. Reminds me a lot of a past Ohio State receiver, Jackson Smith and Jigba, JSN. Like, that's who Egbuka kind of reminds me of. He seems like a Cooper Kupp style player, a Puka Nacua style of player. He just has Rams written all over him, especially now that Cooper Kupp is gone. They have Puka Nacua still, and they have Devontae Adams, but they might want to say, let's go all in on trying to get in this arms race with the Eagles. Like, we need more weapons to score against this football team. Let's add a trio to Matt Stafford's arsenal. Let's add a trio of Puka Nacua, Devontae Adams, and Emeka Egbuka. That makes the Rams scary. And I think the Rams are the second best team in the NFC this year. They were the closest to beating the Eagles. They are a Jalen Carter sack away, potentially, from hosting an NFC championship, and who knows, maybe they could have won a Super Bowl this year, or at least got to it. I think they would have beat Washington in Los Angeles or Arizona, wherever they would have played. So I think the Rams are the top team to watch how they're suiting up this offseason. If they add Egbuka, that's a pick I don't love. Again, I'm not scared of any of these teams, but this is a pick that I'm not rooting for. It would make the Rams a lot better in 2025. The second pick I don't want to see is the Washington Commanders with their first round pick selecting North Carolina running back Amarian Hampton. Again, it's a running back. Are we really thinking that's going to be the difference between the Commanders getting back to the NFC title and taking the Eagles down this year versus getting blown out last year? Probably not. But look at what a star running back did for Jalen Hurts and the Eagles this offseason, or this past year. Not saying Hampton's going to have the same impact as Saquon Barkley, who had literally the best year a running back has ever had in the history of this league. But adding a dynamic running back, a do-it-all 3-down back like that, to Jaden Daniels in the backfield, and he is such a dynamic running threat himself as a quarterback, that can really improve that offense. That, again, I don't think Deebo Samuel is anything at this point to be scared of. He's a shell of who he was, but they have Terry McLaurin, they have Deebo Samuel, they brought back Zach Ertz, you add Amarian Hampton to this backfield, and suddenly Jaden Daniels has some weapons, and I think that could really improve their run game, which is already really good. But you add a style of player of that caliber to the backfield, that's hard to defend. So that's a player I don't want to see going to Washington on day one. The third pick I don't want to see in the NFC, the 49ers getting Penn State tight end Tyler Warren. I just feel like this is something Kyle Shanahan would love, right? They trade away Deebo Samuel. They have Brandon Ayuk still, Ricky Paracel, Jawan Jennings, but they might say, F it. Let's go all in on the Eagles' Goddard Ertz 12 personnel-like style of offense. We have George Kittle tight end. Let's add another one in Tyler Warren and just run play action RPO with Brock Purdy, Christian McCaffrey, Warren, and Kittle, and that's the face of our offense. And Brandon Ayuk's our main target at receiver. We'll see what happens with Ricky Parasol. I think that's the best way they could replace Deebo Samuel. Adding Tyler Warren to that offense, something I don't want to see. And the 49ers have the 11th overall pick. He might be gone by that point, but I could still see him being available. I'm circling the Saints at number 9 for Warren, but if he slips past number 9, I think he's fair game, and I could totally see the 49ers being interested in that if they're trying to continue to build around Brock Purdy. The fourth pick I don't want to see, the Detroit Lions stealing my guy, Tennessee edge rusher James Pierce. This one's obvious. The Lions need pass rush help on the edge. James Pierce, I think there's a good chance he could fall. If you told me he's a top 10 pick, I wouldn't be surprised. If you told me he slipped all the way to the 25 to 32 range, I wouldn't be surprised. There are legitimate concerns about his maturity off the field. He's a raw pass rusher compared to some of these other guys. Maybe, again, it's a deeper class. Team preference allows him to slip. It would suck if you're like, oh my gosh, the Eagles have a chance to get Pierce, and then Detroit takes him. I would hate that pick for sure. And then the last pick I don't want to see in the NFC. The Cowboys taking Boise State running back Ashton Jeanty with the 12th overall pick. From a long-term building perspective, it would be a dumb selection by Jerry Jones, and you'd be like, this is why the Eagles are a better run organization. But from an Eagles playing the Cowboys next year perspective, Ashton Jeanty makes that team better. He is a really, really good running back, and we saw when Dak Prescott had an elite run game with Ezekiel Elliott back in the day, that was a pretty good offense. That was a tough team to beat. Again, I'm not scared of the Dallas Cowboys, even if they add Jeanty this year. I still think Washington would be better than them. They'd still be the third best team in this conference. I think there's a scenario the Giants could be better than them if they add like Travis Hunter with that third overall selection. But if they add Jeanty, naturally, that's just a harder offense to stop. Genty's a really, really good prospect, and I could see Jerry Jones saying, this is my new Ezekiel Elliott. And again, I wouldn't do that. It would be dumb from a long-term building perspective, but for looking at it from the Eagles' lens, playing them this year, yeah, I mean, I'd much rather have them take somebody else, a corner, than have them take Jeanty. That's a win-now kind of move that I think makes it a little tougher to play Dallas next year. So those are 5 moves I wouldn't want to see in the NFC. The Rams getting Emeka Ibuka, the Commanders getting Marion Hampton, the 49ers getting Tyler Warren, the Lions getting James Pierce, and the Cowboys getting Ashton Jeanty. All right, guys, we'll wrap up this Friday edition of Locked On Eagles. Coming up next, the Eagles are meeting with 2 players with top 30 visits scheduled, and I think they are so perfect for Philadelphia. I think these could be the first 2 Eagles picks in this 2025 NFL Draft. I'll tell you who those prospects are and why it makes sense coming up next, right here on Locked On Eagles. All right, so the Eagles are busy at work. They are continuing their draft evaluation process, less than a month away from the 2025 NFL Draft. A lot of top 30 visits coming up, private workouts. Most of these visits have been linemen. So if you're predicting what position the Eagles are going to take with their first or second round pick, not that top 30 visits mean everything, but they mean a lot. The Eagles bring in a lot of guys they've met with in top 30 visit form, even if they didn't draft them originally, like what's his name? Thompson Robinson, DTR. I almost called him Dorial Green Beckham. That's why I stuttered there for a second. DTR, somebody that was a top 30 visit, and they brought him in. The Eagles do that a lot. Most of the players they're bringing in are versatile offensive linemen and their pass rushers. So if you're trying to predict what they're going to do, one of those first 2 picks is going to be a lineman. I think it's very likely that both of those first 2 picks in the first and second round are linemen. And they're scheduled to meet with 2 guys that I think could very well end up being the first 2 picks for the Eagles. Ohio State interior offensive lineman, who we talked about yesterday, Donovan Jackson. I think he makes all the sense in the world. Played left tackle at the end of the year when Simmons went down. He's athletic. He's powerful. Really intriguing upside. Jackson will be available probably at 32, maybe a small trade up. I think he'll probably be there with that pick. He if they're not doing a giant trade up the board, but a small one, I might put my money on Jackson right now. I said last week Donovan Ezereku might be the favorite if the Eagles don't move a whole lot in the first round. The Boston College pass rusher, he might be the favorite for that first pick. I'm changing my mind. I think it's Donovan Jackson from Ohio State. But then they met with a player, they're set to meet with a player from UCLA that just screams Philadelphia Eagle. Femi Oladejo. Femi Oladejo, I just think he has Eagle written all over him. I was watching I've been diving deep into the Edge film over the last few weeks, and I was watching him last week, and he just like the guy makes so much sense. He's a really good leader, a high character player, a very vocal guy, kind of gives you Brandon Graham vibes a little bit. Watching a lot of that Senior Bowl footage, he was kind of the guy rallying the group of pass rushers during practice. He has an insane motor. He's extremely powerful. He's fast downhill. Yeah, he doesn't change direction all that well right now. A little stiff. Doesn't have a super deep pass rush bag. But want to know why? Because just like Jalix Hunt, this was a player that is new to the edge rusher position. If they want to try that Jalix Hunt experiment again, I think Femi Oladejo makes a lot of sense. He was actually a middle linebacker for years and then moved, when he got to UCLA, moved over to the edge rushing position. So if the Eagles want to try this, take a versatile player with a good skill set and move him to a new position and have him meet a ceiling there, like they did with Zach Bond, bring a player in that's new to his position but has upside, and because he's new and raw, allows him to slip down the board a little bit like they did with Jalix Hunt last year. If you want to try that for a third time, Femi Oladejo is a player I think screams the 64th overall pick. If they're not going to take a pass rusher in the first round, let's say it's Donovan Jackson, round 1, 32, or let's say it's like 24 to 32, one of those picks. It's Donovan Jackson, or another position, Nick Emenwari, Malachi Starks. It's not a pass rusher. I really like Femi Oladejo for the Eagles. Is he a top 10 pass rusher for me? No. Right now, I think I have him slated as like the 14th or 15th highest guy on my board. But for a second-round pick at the end of the round, if he's available, I think that makes a lot of sense. I've actually been seeing some mock drafts where he's a first-round pick. I think people are going to fall in love with his character, with his work ethic. And again, he's so new to this position that I think a coach, if you believe in your development staff, your developing program, if you believe in your coaches, bring him in and mold him. Like they believe in Jeff Stoutland, I think the Eagles now believe in Vic Fangio as much. And I think that's why Vic Fangio, I think because of Vic Fangio's presence, the Eagles are going to continue this trend and even enhance it of taking just raw, talented players with upside that have fallen down the board for other reasons. Like I really think, especially with Vic Fangio, who they trust, developing young players. Look at that offense last year, or the defense, the youngest defense in the league, and yet they were number 1 in the league and they won a Super Bowl. Vic Fangio, they trust him. I think it's going to allow them to take chances in the draft. And Oladejo, I don't think he's a really big risk. I think he has a high floor, but I think he has a high ceiling as well. He is still just scratching the surface of what he could do at this position. So I think, they have a top 30 visit scheduled. That doesn't surprise me in the slightest. I think they're really interested in him. Again, right now, gun to my head, who would be the first 2 picks if I had to choose of hundreds of prospects? I would say it's Donovan Jackson, the Ohio State guard, and Femi Oladejo, the UCLA pass rusher. I'm sure by Monday it'll change, but that's where my head is right now as I wrap up this Friday edition of Locked On Eagles. Thanks so much for tuning in and making us your first listen each and every day. Make sure your second listen is the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast. Damian Parsons, Keith Sanchez, they got you. They are going to teach you about all these prospects as we are 1 month away from the 2025 NFL Draft. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Louie DiBiase signing off. Thanks as always for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.